All right, hello again. I am going to go through the matchup profiles and the player profiles that I have for the Stagg Bowl, which will be played this Friday between North Central and Mary Hardin-Baylor. All right, so I'll start off with my matchup preview here. So we've got North Central on the left, Mary Hardin-Baylor on the right, and I mean, you can see looking at these profiles, there's a reason these two teams are playing, right? So North Central, best offense in the country in basically every single phase. Mary Hardin-Baylor with now the best defense in the country, just passed Whitewater in my model after their semifinal game. You know, they really shut down Whitewater's offense for basically the entire game, right? It was a really impressive thing to see. So I'll just go through on the left here. Again, we've got raw stats on the left, adjusted stats on the right for the North Central team profile. Rush percentage, one of the highest rush percentages in the country. And then scoring offense, offense series conversion rate, total adjusted yards per play, just number one in the country at everything, right? So their scoring offense went down after the weather game against Mount Union, but still easily best scoring offense in the country. Series conversion rate, again, I look at that as an efficiency metric. So that is the rate that you move the chains, right? So every time you get a first down, how frequently do you convert to a new set of downs? So using just their base rates without adjusting for opponents, North Central is at 88%, and they've played tougher than average opponents. So their opponent adjusted rate is 93%, which is just outstanding. And then total adjusted yards per play, looking at rushing and passing, that is your yards per play, but then with a boost for good things that happen and a negative for bad things that happen. So you get an additional 9 yards for every first down and an additional 11 yards for every touchdown, and then negative 45 for every turnover. So rushing and passing, North Central just extremely explosive no matter how they're trying to move the ball. If we go over to Mary Hardin-Baylor and look at their offense, so they've got the number 4 scoring offense in the country now. That has been climbing during the playoffs, well, ever since the Trinity game. And series conversion rate, very efficient. But then looking at the rushing and passing breakdown, rushing offense is not as explosive as their passing offense. And part of the reason that we've seen their scoring offense really climb during the playoffs is because they've started leaning more heavily into their passing offense. Their rush percentage has gone down considerably since the first round of the playoffs, where they were, I think, near the top 10 in the country in terms of their rush rate. So by leaning more heavily into their passing offense, which you can see is now second most explosive passing offense in the country. They just passed Central after their game against Whitewater. They can move the ball through the air extremely well. They've got some great receivers. We saw Jordan make some outstanding catches in their last playoff game against Whitewater. So again, number 1 and number 2 passing offenses in the country here. Then looking at scoring defense, North Central really improved after their performance against Mount Union. Some of that is due to weather, which my model doesn't account for. But we've got number 1 versus number 3 in terms of scoring defense, with Whitewater being the number 2 scoring defense. And then looking at series conversion rate, little mea culpa from my video from last week. I had a little mess up in some of my data for Mary Hardin-Baylor's series conversion rate on defense. So they are the number 4 team in the country for series conversion rate defensively, and then North Central a little bit behind at number 57. And then looking at rush defense, neither team is completely lights out on their rush defense. Mary Hardin-Baylor absolutely is better against the run than North Central. But then again, if we compare North Central's rush defense to Mary Hardin-Baylor's rush offense, Mary Hardin-Baylor might have a little bit of an edge there, but I don't know if that's enough to warrant them leaning back into that running game after we've seen their pass offense be so successful. And then we've got, again, two of the best pass defenses in the country, number 4 for Mary Hardin-Baylor and number 7 in the country for North Central. And then looking at our special teams, right? So we've got total adjusted yards per play for kickoff, kick return, punts, and punt returns. And again, this is a yards per play, so your net yards with bonuses for good things that happen, negatives for bad things that happen. So your return yardage is counted against you, and then if you allow a return touchdown, that's negative 20 yards. If you score a return touchdown, that's positive 20 yards. And if you have a kick blocked, punt blocked, that's negative 45. Remember, 45 yards for turnovers. All right, so if we're looking at kickoff units, Mary Hardin-Baylor probably has the edge on special teams just in general in this game. Their kickoff, their punt return teams are all outstanding, just outside of the top 10 in the country on their kickoff team. They were number 1 in the country before the Whitewater game, and then their kickoff yardage just wasn't as good as it was the rest of the year, so it moved them down just a little bit. And then neither team really outstanding in kick returns, right? They're both kind of in the middle or lower half of the country in terms of their kick return averages. So that's your total yards divided by the total number of opponent kickoffs, right? So it's not just on plays that you returned, it's the total number of opponent kickoffs. And then looking at punts and punt returns, Mary Hardin-Baylor has an outstanding punt team. Jefferson Fritz does great work back there. North Central also has a pretty good punt team. And Mary Hardin-Baylor probably has the best duo of punt returners in the country back there with KJ Miller and Jefferson Fritz. North Central, not outstanding on their punt returns. So this is return yardage divided by total number of opponent punts. So North Central doesn't return as many punts as Mary Hardin-Baylor does. They've had a couple touchdowns. So we can get into some of the individual players later. Then the last two items we have here, we've got field goal percentage over expected and PAT percentage over expected. North Central, going into last week, had a lower field goal percentage over expected than they have now. So even with that crazy headwind, crosswind that they were playing in, by making a few field goals in that game, they bumped their field goal percentage over expected up. And my model here doesn't account for wind. Don't have that data for every game, but they played very well with their field goal unit in that game. Mary Hardin-Baylor just slightly below average on their field goal team. So if we're comparing these two, North Central might have a little bit of an edge, but if we look at PAT percentage, UMHB is a little better than North Central. So, right, and all field goal PAT units are a little bit of a wash. So next, we can go into some breakdowns of specific players, right? So we can see here, got the offense at the top, defense in the middle, and specialists at the bottom. So zooming in here, looking at our quarterbacks, we've got two of the most efficient quarterbacks in the country playing here with Lanin and King. And the backup for Mary Hardin-Baylor, kind of a backup, kind of not. Ryan Redding, he is slightly more efficient than King. Some of that is probably because a lot of his games haven't been against the same level of opponent as Kyle King has played against. But whichever one of these guys they put back there is going to do outstanding. And so looking at the columns we've got here, we got total adjusted yards per play, which is the same as it was on the team page. And then on the last column here, offense yard per game, that's yards above replacement player. So, looking at backups, guys who started less than half of their team's games and their efficiency. So you're comparing the relative efficiency times the volume of plays. So Luke Lanen, really, really good numbers, getting above 100 there, especially for a freshman. That is the highest value above replacement for any freshman in the country, which is understandable, directing the best offense in the country. And then we can go into some of the other skill players. So Ethan Greenfield is obviously the workhorse for North Central. He almost has double the value provided to their next most valuable player, which is also their other running back, Terrence Hill. And looking at North Central and Mary Hardin-Baylor and just comparing how where the value is distributed between their skill players, North Central really has it concentrated in their running backs, and especially Ethan Greenfield, and then their top 5 skill guys, right? So they've got their 2 running backs, top 2 receivers with Hardy and Kaminsky, and their tight end really providing the bulk of the value for that offense. And then there's a pretty sharp drop off behind that. And then looking at Mary Hardin-Baylor, a little bit more evenly distributed among the top skill players, but then also, a few more guys are providing value to that team than what North Central is getting. All right, so according to my model here, Ruckman for Mary Hardin-Baylor is the most valuable skill player they've got on that offense. So he, not extremely explosive in terms of his yards per play, but being a consistent threat, getting a good number of receptions, and the value provided as a blocker as well is where you're getting a lot of that. And then going down, Brandon Jordan had an amazing game in the semis, made some great catches up the sideline. And then you can see also looking at comparing the total adjusted yards per play rushing between the 2 teams. You can see again what we saw on the team page. Mary Hardin-Baylor not quite as explosive on the ground as what we're seeing from North Central. North Central's top 2 backs, both over 10 adjusted yards per play, and the only people really within that range for Mary Hardin-Baylor are the 2 quarterbacks running the ball. Kyle King, big guy, physical runner, 9.2 total adjusted yards per play. That's the best on the team, right? So their offense really runs through King, like North Central's kind of runs through Ethan Greenfield. Next, we can look at the defender comparison, right? So again, start off explaining the columns we have here. Havoc plays, those are big plays, your fumble recoveries, forced fumbles, tackles for a loss, sacks, pass breakups, interceptions, and blocks. And then playmaker, total adjusted yards per play, that takes an estimate for the number of snaps that each guy played based on their game started and their games played, and then a weighted average of those havoc plays plus their tackles. So the more disruptive a play is, an interception is a little better than a pass breakup, obviously, the higher those linear weights are. So you can see just the total volume of havoc plays guys are having, who are the most disruptive players on the defense. And then also you can look at, the relative value of their playmaker, total adjusted yards per play. So you can see, like for North Central, they've got a few guys who aren't full-time starters, who are still contributing a lot, right? So we've got Jamari Spivery, for example, on the defensive line, hasn't been considered a starter in any of their games, but at the same time, he's got 14 havoc plays and providing value when he's getting in. Same with D'Angelo Roberson, not a lot of playing time, but when the plays that he's made have been huge. But the guys who are providing the most value are the guys you'd expect, right? So We can see on the North Central side at the top of their defender list here, we've got a couple more D linemen than what we're seeing from Mary Hardin-Baylor, right? So the guys that are making the most disruptive plays for the two defenses are coming from different spots, where North Central getting more from their front than Mary Hardin-Baylor, who gets a lot of their value from their back end, right? Jefferson Fritz, mentioned him already, Gallardi finalist, but he's not even the top defensive back in terms of value on their team, right? So they've got some great playmakers on the back end, some great linebackers, and then defensive line. Not saying they're not doing a great job. Obviously, they shut down Alex Pete for Whitewater last week, but in terms of where the most value is coming from on that defense, the most disruptive plays, mostly coming from the back end for Mary Hardin-Baylor, and then more towards the front end for North Central. Next, we can start looking at specialists. So here we've got looking at the returners first. For North Central, Nick Rummel, Andrew Kaminsky, John Michael Scamacci as their punt returners. Kaminsky, I should say, he's only returned 4 punts on the year, one of them for a touchdown. Right, so that's why you can see his efficiency, total adjusted yards per play, extremely high, but the value is low. So I don't know, maybe find a way to get that guy involved in the offense a little more than what we saw in the semifinals. Putting him back to return some punts wouldn't be a bad idea. And then, like I mentioned, not a lot of value coming on the kick return team for North Central. Looking over at Mary Hardin-Baylor, KJ Miller, one of the best return men in the country, maybe the best. And then Jefferson Fritz also providing some value as a returner. And then for kick returns, we've also got Aaron Sims and Tommy Bowden back there. Most explosive of those is Tommy, but he hasn't been back there very much. The main two guys on kick returns are KJ and Aaron, and the main two guys on the punt returns are KJ and Jefferson. All right, then we can get into our kicker comparison. Tanner Raines really does basically all of it for North Central at this point. Thomas Mitchell and Tanner over the season have kicked about the same number of PATs, but Tanner's really taken over there for most of the season and has handled, punting and kickoffs for the whole year. And then Luke Lanen has done a couple pooch punts, but it's not a staple for North Central like it has been for other teams that we've seen in the Stagg Bowl, like St. Thomas uses that a lot. And then Mary Hardin-Baylor, Anthony Avila, it was talked about on the D3 Football podcast yesterday that he has had some struggles kicking field goals. Honestly, a lot of that is coming from blocks allowed, right? He'd be right at average nationally if we just looked at kicks that have gotten over the line of scrimmage, but he's had 3 blocked this year. So that's why he's in the negative on his, field goal percentage over expected and the value here, which includes blocks. But he does great on kickoffs. So he, with his efficiency on kickoffs, like I mentioned, number 11 in the country as a team, he's providing a ton of value for them on special teams. Jefferson Fritz, so we've got punt, total adjusted yards per play, and between his punts and his returns, they're providing a little bit more value as a punter than he is as a returner. Like you can see above, KJ is the more explosive returner than Jefferson, but still providing positive value there. And then Brandon Cunningham really hasn't been the main guy kicking by any means. All right, so that's how you can look through these previews. If you've got any questions, hit me up on Twitter or comment here on YouTube. Thanks for joining me.